I want you to think about the most generous person you know, the one who shows up without being asked, the one who gives without keeping score, the one who handles the thing nobody else wants to handle and never once mentions it afterward, the one who makes everything work and gets thanked for nothing and keeps going anyway because that is simply who she is. Or at least, that is who she was taught to be. Now I want you to ask yourself something about that person. When was the last time somebody showed up for her? When was the last time somebody handled the thing she needed handled? When was the last time she was the one being taken care of instead of the one doing the taking care of? Oh, and if you cannot remember, if the answer is not coming to you quickly, then you already understand something about me that took me 41 years to understand about myself. My name is Maya, and for 4 decades I was the person my family called when everything fell apart. I paid for my brother's wedding. I funded my sister's college education. I supplemented my parents' retirement every single month so they would not have to worry. I planned every holiday, organized every family gathering, showed up to every crisis with my hands already open and my own needs already set aside before anyone even thought to ask. And when I got married, quietly, beautifully, on a Saturday afternoon in September, not one member of my family came. I want to tell you what happened after that, because that is where this story gets interesting. That is where I stopped being the person my family had spent 40 years counting on. And what happened to them when I did, and what happened to me, is something I think you need to hear. Before I take you back to the beginning, I want to give you 3 questions to carry with you through this entire hour. Because this story has layers that are not visible from the surface, and I want you to be looking for them as we go. The first question is this: at what point does generosity become self-erasure? Because there is a line, and it is not always obvious from the inside, between a person who gives because she genuinely wants to and a person who gives because she was never taught that she was allowed to receive. I could not have told you which side of that line I was on for most of my life. By the end of this story, I will be able to tell you exactly. The second question: what happens to a family that has spent decades outsourcing its survival to one person? When that person finally stops, I want you to think about that. What actually happens when the one who always showed up simply does not show up anymore? Not in anger, not with a speech, not with an explanation. She just stops. And the thing she was holding together has to figure out how to hold itself. I watched that happen in real time. And I want to tell you everything I saw. The third question, the one I want you to hold most carefully: is it still revenge if you do it with complete peace in your heart? Because what I did to my family was not dramatic. I did not expose them. I did not confront them publicly. I did not send a group text or post anything online or make a single phone call designed to wound. I simply built the most beautiful life I could without them. And I let them watch. We are going to answer all 3 of those questions today. But first, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And if you are new here, hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss any of our upcoming stories. Now, let us go back to Durham, North Carolina, to a house on a street called Caldwell Drive, and a little girl who learned very early that love in her family was something you earned by being useful. I grew up in Durham, North Carolina, the middle child of 3. My mother, Loretta, was a nurse who worked long shifts and came home tired in a specific way that middle-aged Black women who have been holding other people's lives together all day come home tired, not just physically, but in some deeper place that sleep does not fully reach. Well, my father, Curtis, was a man who loved his family in the way that some men love their families, from a distance, with good intentions and limited emotional availability, present in the house, but not always present in the room. I had an older brother named Deshaun, 3 years older, loud, charming, the kind of child who takes up space naturally and never apologizes for it. And I had a younger sister named Brianna, 4 years younger, the baby, the one whose arrival had reorganized the family's attention in the way that youngest children's arrivals often do, suddenly and completely. And in the middle of all of that, between Deshaun's noise and Brianna's needs, was me. quiet, capable, observant in the way that middle children who grow up in busy households become observant. Which is to say, I learned very early to read a room and understand what it needed from me before anyone had to ask. I learned to anticipate, to fill silences, to notice when the household was running low on something, groceries, patience, organization, peace, and to quietly replenish it without drawing attention to myself or to the fact that I was the one doing the replenishing. My teachers described me as mature for my age. My relatives called me the responsible one. My mother, on the good days, called me her steady girl. I held on to that phrase, her steady girl, and wore it like an identity because it was the closest thing to being fully seen that my family offered me. I did not understand yet that being called steady was not the same as being fully known. I did not understand yet that being valued for your reliability is a very different thing from being loved for who you are when you are not being reliable. There is a name for what I was developing inside that household, and I want to name it directly because naming it is the beginning of understanding it. It is called parentification. It describes what happens when a child is placed, consciously or not, in the role of emotional caretaker within her family system. The parentified child learns to prioritize everyone else's needs above her own. She becomes the family's emotional regulator, the one who smooths conflict, manages crises, monitors everyone else's emotional temperature, and adjusts her own behavior accordingly. She is praised for this. She is relied upon for this. And because she is praised and relied upon, she comes to understand her value within the family as being directly tied to her usefulness. Not her presence, not her personhood, her function. I was 8 years old the first time I remember consciously managing my mother's emotional state. Loretta had come home from a particularly difficult shift, and I could see from the way she walked through the door, the set of her jaw, the weight in her shoulders, the way she set her keys down more carefully than usual, that something had gone wrong. I did not ask. I did not need to ask. I went to the kitchen, and I made her a cup of tea the way she liked it, and I brought it to her without a word. And she looked at me with an expression that contained both genuine gratitude and something else, something like relief. And she said, "What would I do without you, baby?" I was 8 years old, and I filed that moment the way I filed all the important moments, deeply, quietly, in a place I could access quickly. What would I do without you? I understood, in the wordless way that children understand the things that shape them, that I had done something right, that I had been useful, that being useful was the thing that made me matter in that house. And I carried that understanding forward into every relationship I would build for the next 3 decades without ever once questioning it. Now I want to tell you about Deshawn, because to understand me, you have to understand what I was watching from the middle of that family. Deshawn was the firstborn son in a household where firstborn sons were, without anyone ever formally announcing it, given a different set of rules. He was allowed to be difficult. He was allowed to be inconsistent. He was allowed to want things loudly and receive them without being required to earn them first. When Deshawn needed something, money, support, us attention, accommodation, he asked for it directly and received it directly. When I needed something, I had learned by the time I was 10 years old to need it quietly, to justify it carefully, to make sure the needing did not inconvenience anyone. I do not say this with bitterness even now. I say it with the clarity of someone who has spent real time in a therapist's office, turning over the pieces of her own childhood and understanding what each one meant. I was not mistreated in ways that would be visible from the outside. Nobody was cruel to me. Nobody withheld love from me in ways that were obvious or dramatic. The harm was ambient. It was structural. It was in the architecture of the family's expectations, in who was expected to ask and who was expected to provide, in who was allowed to have needs and who was expected to serve them. And then there was Brianna, 4 years younger, the baby, the one Loretta worried about openly and loudly in a way she never worried about me because I was steady. I could handle things, I did not need the kind of constant emotional monitoring that Brianna seemed to require. And I, who had been steady for so long that I had forgotten I was performing it, never once let anyone see that I needed monitoring too. That underneath the steadiness was a little girl who was tired, who wanted someone to bring her a cup of tea for once, who wanted to be the one whose needs were noticed without having to manage them into invisibility first. I did not allow myself to want those things out loud for a very long time, but I want you to remember that little girl, because she is the reason for everything that comes later. She is the reason I eventually stopped, and she is the reason that when the consequences of my stopping finally arrived, I felt no guilt whatsoever. By the time I was in my mid-20s, I had built a life that looked, from the outside, like the picture of self-sufficiency. A good job as a financial analyst at a firm in Raleigh, 40 minutes from the Durham neighborhood where I grew up and where my parents still lived. My own apartment, a small circle of friends, a savings account I had been building since my first paycheck. I had done everything correctly. I had made myself exactly the kind of person my family pointed to with pride when they needed an example of doing well. And my family had noticed, just not in the way I had quietly hoped they would. What they had noticed was that I had money, and more specifically, that I had money and a deeply ingrained inability to say no to the people I loved. And that combination, I would come to understand, is one of the most expensive things a woman from a family like mine can possess. It started the way these things always start, with something that seemed entirely reasonable. Deshaun was getting married. He and his fiancée Tanya had been together for 3 years, and the wedding was planned for the following spring. The venue they wanted was a converted barn outside Chapel Hill that cost $4,000 for a weekend rental. Deshaun came to me not with a request exactly, but with a situation. The way people who have grown up understanding that a certain person in their family exists to solve situations come to that person. He laid out the numbers. He and Tanya were a little short. He just needed a bridge. He would pay me back after the honeymoon. I wrote the check. I want to be clear about something when I talk about this today because I have spent real time in therapy understanding it. I did not write that check because I was forced to. I wrote it because I loved my brother, and I wanted his wedding to be beautiful, and I had the money available, and saying yes felt in that moment like exactly what a good sister was supposed to do. The problem was not the check. The problem was everything underneath the check. The lifetime of conditioning that had made saying yes feel like love and saying no feel like a personal failure. I did not understand that yet, but I want you to remember that check, because it becomes relevant later in a way that Deshaun did not anticipate. Deshaun did not pay me back. Not that month, not after the honeymoon, not that year, not the year after. When I carefully and apologetically brought it up once about 18 months later, he told me things had been tight since the wedding and he was sure I understood. And I, who had been taught my entire life to be steady and to not make things difficult, said of course I understood. And I let it go. I let it go, and I filed it in that quiet place where I filed all the things I absorbed without reacting to it. I did not know yet that I was building a record. But I was. Brianna's college situation arrived 2 years after Deshaun's wedding. She had been accepted to a nursing program at a private university in Charlotte that Loretta was desperate for her to attend. The financial aid package was not sufficient. The family looked at the numbers, and then the family looked at me. Nobody asked directly. What happened was a series of conversations in which the situation was described in detail, and my financial stability was referenced admiringly, and the gap between what was available and what was needed was laid out clearly, and I was left to draw the conclusion myself, which I did, because I always did. I funded 2 years of Brianna's tuition, $47,000 over 24 months. I want you to hold that number, $47,000, because Brianna will ask me for money again later in this story, and the number will matter then. Brianna graduated, got a job, and for approximately 6 months called me regularly with genuine gratitude. And then life moved forward the way life does, and the gratitude became assumed rather than expressed. And eventually, I became simply the sister who had helped with college, which was nice, rather than the person who had fundamentally altered the trajectory of Brianna's professional life by writing checks that had taken years to save. The parents' retirement came next. Curtis's health had continued to decline, and his reduced working hours had created a gap in the household income. I set up a monthly transfer. Not a loan. I had learned enough by then to understand that calling it a loan created a fiction that eventually became awkward for everyone. I set up the transfer, and I told myself this was what family was for, and that one day when I needed something, they would be there for me in the same way. I believed that. I genuinely believed it. I kept a record of every transfer, not because I planned to use it, but because I am a financial analyst and keeping records is simply what I do. I did not know yet how important that record would become. By my late 30s, I had given my family, in various forms, just over $114,000. I had attended every Christmas, every Easter, every family gathering. I had answered every call. I had solved every problem. I had been, without a single interruption, the most reliable person in the lives of people who had never once asked me how I was doing and actually waited for the answer. And then I met Lawrence. And everything began to change. I met Lawrence at a work conference in Atlanta in the spring of 2019. He was an architect from Savannah, Georgia, with a particular stillness about him that I recognized immediately because I had always been drawn to stillness in other people, perhaps because so much of my own inner life had been required to be quiet for so long. He was thoughtful and unhurried and genuinely curious about the people around him. And on the second evening of that conference, he sat down beside me at dinner and asked me a question I had not been asked in a very long time. He asked me what I was passionate about, not what I did for work, not whether I owned or rented, what I was passionate about. And I, who had spent so many years being asked what I could do for other people, that I had almost forgotten anyone was interested in what I felt. I looked at this man and felt something shift quietly in my chest. I answered him honestly. I told him about my love of cooking, not the practical Sunday kind, but the real kind, the experimental Saturday afternoons I spent trying to recreate my grandmother's dishes from memory. I told him about the novel I had been slowly writing for 6 years, that was 230 pages long, and that nobody in my family knew existed. I told him about the stretch of the Eno River I walked every Sunday morning before the rest of the world was awake, where the light came through the trees in a way that made me feel like myself. Lawrence listened to all of it without once looking at his phone, and when I finished, he said, "I think you are someone who has been living very quietly for a long time." I did not know what to say to that, so I said nothing. Oh, but I thought about it for a long time afterward. He proposed 2 years later in my kitchen on a Sunday afternoon while I was cooking. No elaborate setup, no surprise audience, just the two of us, in the space where I was most myself, with a ring he had chosen because it looked like something I would actually wear. I said yes before he finished the sentence, and then I told my family. The response was not cold. It was not hostile. It was something more quietly devastating than either of those things. It was distracted. Loretta said, "Congratulations, baby," and immediately began talking about whether the wedding would conflict with Deshawn's work schedule. Curtis said that's good news, and then asked if I could look into whether the monthly transfer could be increased, because the property taxes were coming up. Brianna texted congratulation emojis, and then sent a follow-up asking whether I could help cover a car repair that had come up unexpectedly. Nobody asked about Lawrence. Nobody asked what he was like or how he had proposed or whether I was happy. The wedding planning began, and it became clear almost immediately that my family's engagement with the event would be structured around what they needed from it, rather than what I needed for it. And then Curtis mentioned, 6 weeks before the wedding, casually in the middle of a phone call, that he and Loretta had been thinking they might need to visit his brother in Virginia that same weekend. I asked him to clarify. He said they had not confirmed anything yet. I waited 2 weeks. He did not bring it up again. I asked directly. Oh, he said Loretta had already told Virginia they were coming and it was complicated to change now. He said he was sure I understood. I did not respond. I ended the call, and I sat in my car in the parking lot of the grocery store, and I understood something with a clarity that surprised me. My family was not coming to my wedding, and the reason was simpler and older than any scheduling conflict. My needs had never, in 40 years, been treated as the kind of needs that required the family to rearrange themselves. A wedding was apparently not going to be the exception. I made one more call to Loretta. I asked her directly, "Mama, are you coming to my wedding?" And she said, "Maya, you know I would love to be there. It's just that your father's brother has been having a hard time and family is family. You understand. You of all people understand that. You of all people understand that." I said, "I understand, Mama." I hung up, and I made a decision. I was going to get married anyway, beautifully, on my terms, with the people who actually showed up for me. And I was going to pay very close attention to who those people turned out to be. And I was going to remember, with great clarity, who chose Virginia. Lawrence and I were married on a Saturday in September in a small ceremony at a botanical garden in Raleigh. 14 people were there. Lawrence's parents, who had driven up from Savannah, Lawrence's sister and her husband, my maid of honor, Camille, my closest friend for 11 years, 3 colleagues who had become genuine friends, and a woman named Miss Odessa, my grandmother's oldest friend, 74 years old, who had driven herself 2 hours from Greensboro because, as she told me when she arrived, your grandmother would have wanted someone here who loved you before you were useful to anybody. I had to excuse myself for a few minutes after Miss Odessa said that. I went to the garden bathroom and I stood at the sink and I let myself cry for exactly 3 minutes. Not from sadness, from the specific relief of being seen clearly by someone who was not asking anything from me in return for the seeing. Lawrence wrote his own vows, and they contained a line I have repeated to myself on every difficult day since. I see you. Not the version of you that makes things easier for everyone else. The whole version. I am here for the whole version. When the officiant pronounced us married, I looked out at those 14 faces and felt something I had not expected. Not grief for the people who were not there, not anger. Something cleaner and more surprising than either of those things. I felt, for the first time in my adult life, that I was exactly where I was supposed to be. That every single person in that garden had chosen to be there. Not out of obligation, not because family is family and you understand. Because they wanted to be there. Because I mattered to them in a way that was not contingent on what I could provide. I had never been in a room like that before. My phone had 3 messages from family members that day. Deshaun sent congratulations, followed by a question about whether I could look into refinancing options for his mortgage. Brianna sent a heart emoji and did not follow up. Loretta called 3 days later to say she had heard it went beautifully and that they really needed to talk about the property taxes. I listened. I said I would look into the property taxes. I hung up. And then I sat with Lawrence on our back porch, and I said out loud to another person, for the first time, I think I have been someone's function for my entire life, and I think I am done with that now. Lawrence did not rush past that. He said, "Tell me what you need that to look like." And I told him every single thing, including the part about the $114,000, and including what I had already decided I was going to do next. What I did next was not dramatic. That is the part I most want you to understand. There was no confrontation, no ultimatum, no letter at this stage, no group call where I laid out grievances and demanded accountability. I had watched enough of my family's emotional performances over the years to know that I did not want to give them one of my own. What I did was quieter than that. And because it was quiet, it took longer to register. And because it took longer to register, when it finally landed, it landed completely. The first thing I stopped was the monthly transfer. 8 months after my wedding, I simply did not set it up for the following month. I kept my phone nearby and I waited. 4 days later, Loretta called asking if everything was okay with my account. I said my account was fine. I said I had decided to stop the transfer. She asked why. I said I had been contributing to the family's finances for many years, and I had decided it was time to redirect those resources toward my own life. There was a long silence, and then she said, "I don't understand." I said, "I know." I did not explain further. I did not apologize. I did not soften it. I let the silence do what silence does. The second thing I stopped was my availability. Calls after 9 in the evening went unanswered. Texts about financial situations did not receive same-day responses. When Deshaun called one evening to discuss the mortgage refinancing he had mentioned on my wedding day, and I want you to notice that he had first raised this on my wedding day, the day I got married, as a follow-up to his congratulations, I let it go to voicemail. I listened to the message. I did not call back. Not that day. Not the next day. When I did call back, 3 days later, I said simply, "I am not in a position to help with that. No elaboration, no I'm sorry, no let me explain, just I am not in a position to help with that." Deshaun was quiet for a moment and then said he was not sure what was going on with me lately. I said I was doing very well, actually. I wished him a good evening. I ended the call. The third thing I stopped was showing up. This is the one that took longest for my family to fully absorb because I had been showing up so consistently and for so long that my presence at family events had simply become assumed. Like a piece of furniture, like a reliable appliance, like something you do not notice until it is not there. The first event I did not attend was a 4th of July gathering at my parents' house. I did not call to say I was not coming. I did not send a text explanation. I simply did not go. Lawrence and I spent that 4th of July at a rooftop party at Camille's apartment, and I ate good food and laughed until my face hurt and watched fireworks from a rooftop with people who had chosen to be in my life, and I felt something I had not felt at a 4th of July in as long as I could remember. I felt like a guest. Not like the coordinator. Not like the one who had brought half the food and organized the seating and managed the music and made sure everyone was comfortable. Like a guest. It was extraordinary. My family called that evening. I did not answer. The next morning, Loretta left a voicemail saying she had not seen me and was I coming later and to call her back. I texted, "Hope it was a good evening." That was all. Now here is the part I want you to pay close attention to, because this is where the story shifts and where the investment my family had made in keeping me in my function started to show its true cost. Not to me this time, but to them. 6 months after my wedding, Deshaun's marriage hit a significant financial difficulty. He and Tanya had taken out a second mortgage on their house that was now creating a monthly payment they could not comfortably sustain, and Deshaun had also lost a significant client at his business around the same time. This was a real crisis, not a manufactured one, not an exaggeration for effect. It was a genuine financial emergency of the kind that would have, in any previous year of my adult life, resulted in a phone call to me followed by a transfer within 48 hours. Deshaun called. I let it go to voicemail. He called again. I let it go to voicemail. He texted, "Maya, I really need to talk to you." I replied, "I hope you find a good solution." I did not call back. I want to be honest about what that felt like. It did not feel good the way revenge in movies feels good, triumphant and clean and satisfying in a simple way. It felt complicated. It felt like standing at a door I had always walked through and choosing not to walk through it, and feeling the weight of that choice in my body even as I knew it was the right one. I thought about the $4,000 barn. I thought about the $47,000. I thought about the $114,000 total. And I thought about Virginia. I thought about you, of all people, understand. And then I put my phone down and I went for a walk along the Eno River, and I let the light come through the trees, and I let the complicated feeling exist without trying to resolve it. Deshaun called our parents. Loretta called me. I answered that one because I wanted to hear what she would say. She said Deshaun was in trouble and the family needed to come together and she was sure I could help. I said, "Mama, I want you to think about something. When I needed my family to come together, what happened?" She was quiet. I said, "I hope Deshaun finds his way through this." And I ended the call. I sat with the grief of that. Because there was grief. Real grief. Complicated and layered and not something I tried to hurry past. I was not a person who enjoyed watching people struggle. I was not built for cruelty. But I understood the difference. And this is the distinction that my therapist, Dr. Patricia Ware, had helped me build very carefully over many months. Between cruelty and consequence. I had not created Deshaun's financial situation. I had not manufactured this crisis to punish him. I had simply stopped being the infrastructure that had always prevented him from fully experiencing the consequences of his own choices. The consequence was his. The choice not to absorb it on his behalf was mine. Deshaun did not lose his house. He figured it out the way people figure things out when they are required to figure them out themselves. He and Tanya sold one of their cars and renegotiated with the bank and got through it. It took 8 months, and it was genuinely difficult. I watched it from a distance with a complicated heart, and I did not intervene once. The moment I want to tell you about now. The moment that I think of as the center of this story, the moment everything crystallized, came 14 months after my wedding. It was a Thursday evening in November, and my phone rang with my mother's number, and when I answered, Loretta's voice was different from any version of it I had heard before. Not upset in the managed way she usually expressed distress, actually frightened. Curtis had collapsed at home. He was being taken to the hospital. She did not know what was happening yet. I want to tell you what I felt in that moment because I think it matters for you to understand who I am. I felt fear. Real, immediate, physical fear for my father. Regardless of everything, Curtis was my father. The man who had been at every Christmas table, who had taught me to drive, who had sat in the stands at my high school graduation. The love was real. It had always been real. And in that moment on the phone with Loretta, the love was all I felt. And then I felt something else, something I had not anticipated, and that took me a moment to identify. I felt the pull, the specific, deeply grooved 41-year-old pull of being needed by my family in a crisis. The pull that said, "This is what you do. This is who you are. This is the moment that matters. Get in your car and go." I knew that pull intimately. I had been answering it my entire life. I knew exactly what it felt like, and I knew exactly where it led. To me, at the center of someone else's emergency, organizing and managing and being steady, until the emergency passed and I was no longer needed and the family returned to its default setting of not seeing me. I sat with the pull for a long time that evening. Not hours, maybe 20 minutes. But a real 20 minutes where I did not move and I did not reach for my car keys and I did not call anyone. I sat with it, and I asked myself the question that Dr. Ware had told me to ask whenever the pull arrived. If I go, who am I going for? And I answered it honestly. I was going for Curtis. But I was also going because the family expected me to go. Because not going felt like a violation of something so deeply installed in me that it was almost indistinguishable from my own values. Because showing up in a crisis was the thing that had always proven to my family and to myself that I was a good person. And I realized, by sitting in that stillness, that I needed to separate those things. I could love my father and still choose not to be the family's emergency infrastructure. Those two things were not the same thing, and I had spent 41 years treating them as if they were. I called Loretta back. I asked her which hospital. I asked if she had someone with her. She said Brianna was on her way. I said, "Good. Tell Daddy I love him. Tell him I will call tomorrow." And I ended the call. I want to tell you what happened in that hospital waiting room that night, because Camille was there. She had gone because Loretta had called her, and Camille told me about it afterward with the careful honesty that only a real friend can offer. Loretta had walked in expecting to see me. She had looked at the door every time it opened for the first 2 hours. She had asked Brianna twice where Maya was, and when it became clear that I was not coming, something had shifted in her face that Camille described as the specific expression of someone realizing something for the first time that they probably should have understood a long time ago. Curtis was stabilized that night. A cardiac event, serious but survivable, requiring medication and lifestyle changes but not surgery. He came home 4 days later. I visited him that weekend. I brought food. I sat with him for 2 hours. I held his hand. I told him I loved him. I meant every single word. And when I left, I hugged Loretta at the door, and she held on a second longer than usual, and she said, "I didn't think you were coming at all." And I said, "I came for Daddy." She nodded. She understood the distinction. I could see in her face that she understood exactly what I meant. Deshawn was at the hospital that night. Brianna was at the hospital that night. And in the days that followed, in the organizing of Curtis's care schedule and the management of his medical appointments and the research into his dietary restrictions and the handling of the insurance paperwork, my family discovered something that I had always known and that they had never had to confront directly. Those things are a lot of work. Without me doing them automatically and invisibly, someone had to do them deliberately and visibly. And doing them deliberately and visibly made their cost apparent in a way that my doing them had never allowed it to be. Deshawn handled 3 days of it before calling Brianna to say he did not know how Maya had done this for years. Brianna handled a week of it before telling Loretta she was exhausted. Loretta, who had been a nurse for 30 years and who understood the logistics of medical care better than almost anyone, said quietly, "She always just did it. I never had to ask." That sentence reached me secondhand through Camille. She always just did it. I never had to ask. I sat with that sentence for a long time. Not with satisfaction, though something in me recognized the significance of it. With something more complicated. With the grief of understanding that it had taken my absence to make my presence visible. That it had taken me stopping for them to see what I had been doing. That the most generous thing I had ever done for my family might have been leaving them to figure it out themselves. Over the following year, each member of my family came to me in their own way and in their own time. Not all at once, not with a group apology or a family meeting, one at a time, in the specific way of people who have been forced by circumstances to reckon with something they had been successfully avoiding. Brianna came first. She called me 3 months after Curtis's hospitalization, and she was different on that call in a way I noticed immediately. Quieter, less certain of the reception she would receive, choosing her words with a care she had never previously applied to our conversations. She said she had been thinking a lot about the tuition, the $47,000. She said she had never really sat with what that had meant, what it had required of me, what it had cost me, what I had given up or delayed in my own life in order to provide it. She said she was sorry, not the reflexive sorry of someone trying to move past an uncomfortable moment. A real sorry, the kind with weight behind it. I listened. I said, "I appreciate you saying that," and I meant it. And then I said, "I need you to understand that things between us are going to be different going forward. Not punitive, not cold, different." She said she understood. I believed her. I told her I loved her. I meant that too. Deshawn took longer. Deshawn's reckoning arrived 8 months after Curtis came home in a phone call that I suspect he had been working up to for some time. He started with the $4,000 check from his wedding. He acknowledged it directly and specifically. The amount, the fact that he had never repaid it, or the way he had handled the one time I had raised it. He said he was ashamed of that. He said he had treated me the way the family had always treated me, as someone whose resources existed to serve everyone else's needs, and that he had not questioned it because the family system had never required him to question it. And that was not an excuse. It was just the truth of what had happened. He said he wanted to make it right financially, and he asked me what I needed from him. I told him I did not need the money back. I told him what I needed was for him to understand what the pattern had been and to commit to something different. He said he was working on it. That was enough for now. That was actually more than I had expected. Loretta was the most complex. She and I had 3 real conversations over the course of that year. Not the performed version of closeness we had maintained for decades, but actual conversations, with actual honesty in them, in which things were said that had been waiting to be said for a very long time. She told me that she had leaned on me because I had never pushed back, and that she had interpreted my not pushing back as meaning I was fine, and that she understood now that a child who has been taught that her needs are less important than everyone else's does not push back. She simply absorbs. She said, "I made you into something that was easier for me instead of letting you be someone." That sentence. I made you into something that was easier for me instead of letting you be someone. I held on to that for weeks, not because it healed everything, but because it was true. And hearing the truth from my mother, spoken plainly and without defense, was something I had waited 41 years for. The relationships I rebuilt with my family after all of that were smaller and more honest than what had come before. Less performance, more reality. I was no longer the infrastructure. I was a daughter, a sister, a person with her own life who showed up when she chose to and who said no when no was the honest answer. It was imperfect. It was sometimes uncomfortable. It was real in a way that our family had never been real before. And I found that I could live inside that reality in a way I had never been able to live inside the performance. Here is what I also want to tell you, because the story does not end with my family. The story ends with what I built in the space that opened up when I stopped spending myself on people who had never been required to account for what they were taking. I let Camille fully in for the first time in 11 years of friendship. I joined a book club, 8 Black women between 32 and 58, and I found, sitting around that table every month, the specific relief of being understood from the inside, of saying the true thing about my family, and having 6 women nod not with sympathy but with recognition. Lawrence's parents became something I had not anticipated needing as much as I needed it. His mother, Gloria, called every Sunday just to talk, and his father, Bernard, called me good people without needing a reason. I understood for the first time what it felt like to be valued for existing rather than for providing. I finished my novel. 312 pages. It was published the following spring. On a Thursday evening in a small bookshop in Raleigh, 14 people came to the launch. Lawrence, Camille, Bernard, and Gloria, the 8 women from the book club, 2 colleagues, and Miss Odessa, who had driven 2 hours again, who held my first copy in both hands and said your grandmother would have been so proud. I looked around that bookshop at those 14 faces, the same number as had been at my wedding, and I understood something about the life I had built in the space of my own choosing. It was small and real and specific and entirely mine. Every person in that room had chosen to be there, not because I was useful, not because I was steady, not because they needed something from me, because they wanted to be there, because I mattered to them in a way that had nothing to do with what I could provide. And 3 of my family members were there too, Loretta, Brianna, and Deshaun, who had driven up from Durham with his wife, Tanya, and who stood in the back of that bookshop holding a copy of my novel, the novel nobody in my family had known existed, and who came up to me afterward and said, "I didn't know you were writing this whole time." And I said, "There is a lot about me you didn't know." And he said, "I want to know." And I said, "I know." And that was enough. That was exactly enough. Here is what I know about patterns. The pattern I grew up inside. The parentified child, the family caretaker. Well, the one whose value is tied to her function does not announce itself. It shows up at breakfast. It shows up in the slight lean of a parent's attention toward one child over another. It shows up in being called steady instead of being asked how you are. It shows up in an 8-year-old making her mother's tea and being told, "What would I do without you?" and filing that sentence as love because nobody had ever taught her the difference. The love was real. The pattern was also real. Both of those things are true simultaneously, and neither cancels the other out. And holding both of those things true at the same time, without collapsing into either pure forgiveness or pure resentment, is the actual work. The daily, ongoing, unglamorous work of someone who has decided to understand her own history rather than simply survive it. Walking away from a family that cannot see you is not the same as giving up on love. It is the quiet, courageous decision of a woman who finally understood that belonging is not something you earn through usefulness. It is something you are given freely by people who see you and want you in the room, not for what you provide, but for who you are when you are not providing anything at all. I am 43 years old. I am married to a man who asked me what I was passionate about. I have a best friend who waited 11 years for me to arrive fully. I have in-laws who call me good people without needing a reason. I have a book with my name on it. I have Sunday mornings by the river with the light coming through the trees. I have a family that is smaller and more honest than the one I grew up in. And I have the particular peace, the quiet, earned, unperformable peace of a woman who stopped making herself small for people who had never once offered to make more space. And I have one more thing, something I want to leave you with before I go. I have the knowledge of what I am worth. Not what I can provide, not what I can absorb, not what I can organize or fund or manage or sustain, what I am worth. As a person, as a woman, as someone who existed before she was ever useful to anyone and who will continue to exist long after the usefulness is gone. That knowledge, quiet, certain, unshakable, is the most expensive thing I have ever acquired, and it did not cost me $1 single. That is what breaking the pattern looks like. That is what it costs, and that is what it gives back. Before I let you go, I want to sit with you for just a moment. Because if you have stayed with this story this long, something in it moved in a familiar direction inside you. Maybe you are the Maya in your family right now. Maybe you have been writing the checks and planning the holidays and answering every call and managing every crisis and telling yourself that this is just what family does, without ever stopping to ask whether the people you are doing it for would do the same for you. You already know the answer. You have probably known it for a long time. You are allowed to put it down. You are allowed to stop. You are allowed to let the consequences of other people's choices land on other people for once. You are allowed to build something that does not require you to earn your place in it every single day. I want to ask you something in the comments before you go. Are you the Maya in your family? Have you ever stopped being useful to find out who showed up anyway? Drop your answer below, or just drop a heart if you're not ready to put it into words yet. I read every single comment on this channel, every one. And if this story named something you have been carrying without a name, share it with one person who needs to hear it. You never know who is sitting somewhere right now holding 40 years of steadiness and wondering if they are allowed to set it down. Subscribe so the next one finds you the moment it goes up. Thank you for being here. Thank you for letting someone else's truth sit next to your own for a little while. Thank you for being the kind of person who stays until the end. That is not a small thing. That is, in fact, the whole thing. Stay quiet, stay aware, break the pattern. Every story on this channel is built from truth, the kind of truth that lives in patterns, not in names. The characters you met today are composites. The pain they carried is not. If something in this story found you, that was not an accident. Take care of yourself. And if you need more than a story can give, please reach out to someone who can hold it with you.